All right, guys, Mr. J here. This is A&P 2, Week 6 review, Part 1 of 2. In this video, I'm going to be going over two main things. I'm going to be going over blood pressure medications and how we can reduce hypertension, so how we can decrease blood pressure, as well as a brief overview over the lymphatic system. And the next review video is going to be over immunity, okay, which is a big function of the lymphatic system. So let's get started. So, blood pressure. A lot of people, especially in America, have hypertension, which means a big tension in the arteries, okay? So we have too high of blood pressure. And usually when we're taking medications for it, it's going to be dealing with lowering that blood pressure. But in order to understand that, we need to know how we measure blood pressure in general. So we take this equation. This is mean arterial pressure, MAP, so basically blood pressure. Okay, and the way we measure it is by taking cardiac output times peripheral resistance. Let me break that down. Cardiac output is the stroke volume, which is how much blood, so volume of blood being pumped out of your heart. So that's your stroke volume times your heart rate. And your heart rate is in beats per minute. So this is how many times your heart beats per minute. So if we want to decrease blood pressure, one thing that we can do is decrease the cardiac output. So we can either decrease the stroke volume, so the volume of blood being pumped, and or the amount of times that we are beating our heart per minute, okay? So that's one way we can decrease blood pressure is by decreasing cardiac output. And that's going to be primarily through the beta blockers, which I'll talk about. And then there's peripheral resistance. This is basically the resistance of your arteries when they're being stretched. So think of if you have like a balloon, right? So as you blow into the balloon, there's some resistance there that's basically preventing you from blowing it up. That pressure that's pushing back is the peripheral resistance of your arteries. So another way we can decrease blood pressure, we want to get this number lower, is by decreasing the peripheral resistance. And that's primarily going to be through the alpha blockers, okay? So let me talk through this very quickly. These are different medication types that are going to decrease arterial pressure by decreasing one of these two variables, okay? Alpha blockers. Alpha starts with an A, which are in the arteries. Okay, alpha blockers are going to block alpha receptors on the arteries, okay? Because these receptors, what they normally do is they will have a ligand called epinephrine. So this is epinephrine. And when epinephrine normally binds to these receptors, so when they bind to these receptors, what will happen is vasoconstriction. Okay, this is a part of your fight or flight response. You need like really constricted arteries so that you can pump blood throughout your body faster. So when epinephrine binds, what happens to arteries is that they vasoconstrict. Okay, well, let's think about this. If we're having epinephrine bind to our alpha receptors in our arteries, it's going to vasoconstrict. It's going to decrease the amount of surface area in our arteries, which in turn will increase the resistance of our arteries to being stretched. Because if your heart's beating and you're narrowing that little tunnel, you're decreasing the volume, by law, I think it's Boyle's law, pressure is going to increase. So there's going to be a lot of resistance against that artery. So we want to instead vasodilate if we want to decrease the peripheral resistance. This is where our alpha blockers come in. So we have drugs that will look something like this. They'll have like a square portion to bind, but then they're going to block those receptors. So they'll look something like this. And they are going to bind to these receptors, which disallows epinephrine from binding. Okay, so if we're blocking these receptors, we're not letting epinephrine bind. Well, guess what? That's going to cause vasodilation when the meds, when they block alpha receptors. So our medication, the mechanism by which it's working is it's blocking those alpha receptors from being bound to epinephrine. And by blocking them, it's going to cause vasodilation rather than vasoconstriction, which is what happens when epinephrine would bind to those receptors. Since we're vasodilating, there will be less peripheral resistance, less resistance of pumping in the arteries. Therefore, it'll also decrease our blood pressure, which is a good thing. Another medication we talked about is going to be the beta blockers. Beta blockers refer to beta receptors in a beating heart. So that's how you can remember beta in a beating heart. The heart tissue, either the cardiac muscles themselves or also the pacemaker cells. We'll talk more about the cardiac muscle tissue though. They have beta receptors. Again, the ligand for these beta receptors is the same exact thing. It's epinephrine or norepinephrine. So when these guys bind, when epinephrine binds to these beta receptors, that is going to cause an increased heart rate and increased stroke volume. So if epinephrine is binding, increased heart rate, increased stroke volume, we know what that's going to do. If we increase these variables, it increases our cardiac output, therefore increases our blood pressure. So what do we want to do? We want to block these receptors. We want to block them, so if epinephrine does not bind, the heart rate will actually go down and the stroke volume will go down. So the same exact thing. So these beta blockers are going to come in. They are going to bind to those receptors, blocking epinephrine, and that is going to lead to a decreased heart rate, decreased stroke volume, and therefore decreased blood pressure. So these are two very common medications you may have heard about that decrease mean arterial pressure by decreasing either peripheral resistance with our alpha blockers or our cardiac output with our beta blockers. Good there. The last one I talked about, and there are other blood pressure medications like diuretics, but I'm going to talk primarily about ACE inhibitors. ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. Angiotensin, angio means blood vessel, tensin literally means like tension, right? So it's a protein that's going to vasoconstrict again. And remember, if we have a lot of angiotensin in our system, it's going to increase our peripheral resistance because our blood vessels are going to be vasoconstricting. Okay, they're going to be tension there. So it's going to vasoconstrict. So we want to inhibit this enzyme from converting things to angiotensin. So what I have here, this is going to be the angiotensin converting enzyme. This is going to be an angiotensin precursor. So the precursor is going to go into the enzyme normally and get converted into angiotensin. But remember, we don't want that. So we're going to use an ACE inhibitor. So one of the inhibitors is going to look something like this again. And it's going to bind to this enzyme. And if it binds to the enzyme, well, now angiotensin precursors can't bind, can't get converted into angiotensin. So it decreases angiotensin production. Therefore, it will vasodilate our blood vessels. It'll vasodilate because we're not tensing them up. We're not vasoconstricting them because we don't have angiotensin. Therefore, our blood vessels will relax. This is a part of a blood pressure control mechanism called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. We're not going to talk about that in detail. Just know that angiotensin is a protein that vasoconstricts, and those ACE inhibitors prevent that protein from being synthesized. Therefore, it vasodilates. Therefore, it decreases blood pressure. Okay? So there's a lot of different ways that you could be tested on this. Just based upon how many moving parts there are. So make sure you are very comfortable with this sequence. Awesome. We're going to move on to the second part, which is going to be the brief overview of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system does three primary functions. Okay, it's going to, number one, reclaim fluid lost at the capillaries. It is going to deal with immunity. And right now I am forgetting the third, but those are the two ones that I would primarily put into, is reclaiming fluid, and also it's going to protect you with its immune function. Okay, so lymphatic system. Spelled like this, lymphatic system. So the first thing is it's going to reclaim fluid at the capillaries. What do I mean by that? Well, at the capillaries, you're going to have a very, very small blood vessel. Okay, and then you're going to have some tissue surrounding it. So let's just say these are your body tissue cells that are surrounding your blood vessels. And there's going to be fluid in between the capillary and the body tissue right here. So this is right here called the interstitial fluid. And the interstitial fluid will contain water, ions, proteins, those types of things. And the capillaries, as we know, are going to basically be carrying nutrients and oxygen to be delivered to the body tissues. So in order for us to feed the body tissues, we need to get some fluid and nutrients out of the capillaries. This is occurring through little windows, little gaps in the capillaries called fenestra. Fenestra, I believe in Latin it means window, so it's like an opening. And so as the capillaries are flowing blood, so there's going to be one blood cell at a time moving through these capillaries, they are going to be pumping out little bits of fluid. And that's good because nutrients are going to go here and they're going to feed the cells, which is a good thing. But that's part of our bloodstream. And if we just lost all of the fluid from our bloodstream, we would no longer have blood, we'd have no blood pressure, and we'd die. So we need to reclaim this extra fluid that we're pumping into the interstitium. Most of the time, it will be pumped back in to the blood capillaries because there's going to be albumins and globulins that are these big proteins that draw water back in, so that draws fluid back in to the capillaries to basically go into our circulation. So after it feeds the tissues, a lot of it is pumped back. It's called osmotic pressure. It's going to pull most of the fluid back in. And every day, about 27 liters of the 30 liters that's pumped out of your capillaries are reclaimed into the bloodstream. Okay, so let me step back. 30 liters of fluid are pumped out of the capillaries every day, okay? 27 liters, so 90%, is directly drawn back into the capillaries, and the venous capillaries, it's going to start going back to the heart, is reclaimed. Well, what about the other 3 liters? This is going to be reclaimed through the lymphatic system. So 3 liters of fluid is going to be reclaimed in the lymphatic system. So what this will look like is when there's excess fluid in the interstitium that did not get pumped back into the capillaries, there will be new vessels called lymphatic vessels that are going to be extending into this space. And the excess fluid, that 3 liters of fluid, is going to make its way, let me make these kind of three-dimensional, is going to make its way into these lymphatic vessels. And eventually those lymphatic vessels will go through lymph nodes, which are kind of TSA checkpoints, and then make their way back into your subclavian veins. And we know that veins bring fluid back to the heart. Okay, so all roads lead to Rome. All lymphatic roads lead to your subclavian veins that eventually return all this 3 liters of fluid back into your circulatory system, into your circulation. Okay, so that is the primary function of the lymphatic system, is to reclaim this fluid that was lost at the capillary level, which is a good thing because then our blood pressure doesn't drastically drop and increase with all this fluid moving here and there. I think I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to leave the next section for more of the immune portion of things. I did give you this diagram, however, to just point out some structures of the lymphatic system. So let me roll through this real quick. First off, we've got our heart obviously beating, and it's going to be pumping blood all the way down to the capillary level. So it's kind of moving in this direction. So as we look at this, we can see that, hey, sometimes the fluid is poured out into the lymphatic vessels or lymphatic capillaries, make its way to checkpoints like lymph nodes, and then eventually go back into your venous system and then return back to the heart. However, there's some blood that's pumped to the spleen, which is also a lymphatic organ. It's dealing with red blood cell destruction, recycling, that type of thing. There's also going to be some red bone marrow making some lymphocytes, which we'll talk about in the next video. There's going to be some other lymphocytes, T and B cells, which I'll talk about next video, that are going to mature in the thymus and other lymphatic tissues like lymph nodes. And again, once it gets back to the blood capillaries, there's going to be more fluid leaked out, so we can see that in the lymphatic capillaries. And then it's going to eventually return back to the heart. So these are just a few of the structures of the lymphatic system. I doubt that I would test you over these, but just know they are a part of this whole system in general. Alrighty, so next video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about innate versus adaptive immunity and all the cell types and all of the functions of that immune system. So I hope this was helpful. Please drop any questions in the comments below. And yeah, happy studying and thanks for watching.